1812. Napoleon Bonaparte stood over a map of Europe, gazing at it like a child at a plate of food he had almost entirely devoured. Almost entirely. One large cold patch remained. It was called Russia. France already controlled Spain, Italy, Germany, Poland, and Holland. Half of Europe's monarchs were either Napoleon's relatives or men terrified of becoming his enemies. He had crushed the Austrians, defeated the Prussians, and routed the Russians at Austerlitz, a word that still made Tsar Alexander I's eye twitch. It seemed he should simply live and enjoy his reign, ruling Europe and eating croissants. But no. The problem was England. Napoleon couldn't defeat England. It was an island with the world's best navy, while the French fleet, after Trafalgar, was mostly splinters and bitter memories. So Napoleon devised another plan. If you can't beat the enemy, strangle them economically. He forbade all of Europe from trading with Britain, a policy known as the Continental Blockade. It was brilliant on paper. One problem, however. Russia observed it about as well as a schoolchild follows a sleep schedule during holidays. That is, not at all. Russian merchants continued to trade with the British. Tsar Alexander pretended not to notice, and Napoleon pretended to believe him. Then he stopped pretending. By 1812, enough mutual irritation had accumulated between the two emperors to ignite the greatest military catastrophe of the 19th century. Napoleon decided, I will enter Russia, swiftly defeat their army in one major battle. Alexander will sue for peace, will sign a treaty, the blockade will be re-established, England will be strangled, and everyone will be content. By his calculations, the campaign would last a maximum of 3 weeks. He didn't even bother to bring proper winter uniforms, assuming it would all be over by summer. This was one of the costliest acts of overconfidence in human history. June 1812. The border of the Russian Empire. The Grand Army crossed the Niemen River, 670,000 men. This wasn't merely an army, it was a moving city. French, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, Austrians, Spaniards. Napoleon had forged nearly all of Europe into a single fist and hurled it eastward. The soldiers were in high spirits. Officers traced routes to Moscow on maps. Quartermasters calculated provisions. Provisions, it turned out, would last for about a month. The Russians met this invasion in the only way one can meet 670,000 men coming to kill you. They began to retreat. Not out of fear, but because War Minister Barclay de Tolly, a Scot in Russian service with an accent so thick no one understood him but everyone obeyed, had decided it. The plan was simple. Avoid a general engagement, retreat, stretch French supply lines, and burn everything that couldn't be carried away. Napoleon waited for a battle. The Russians kept withdrawing. He pursued them through Lithuania, through Belarus, through endless forests and fields where there was nothing but dust, flies, and increasingly irritated French soldiers. Villages were burned during the retreat. Food depots were destroyed. Wells were filled in. Horses began to drop from lack of fodder. Soldiers fell ill from the heat, dirty water, and dysentery, which spreads through an army as fast as gossip. After a month of marching, the Grand Army had lost 100,000 men, and not a single one in battle. Diseases, desertion, heat stroke, drowned men at river crossings, stragglers cut down by Cossacks. This was not war. It was a slow bleeding on the march. In August, the Russians finally gave battle at Smolensk. The city was burning. The Russians themselves had set it ablaze before withdrawing. Napoleon took the ruins. He expected Alexander to sue for peace now. Alexander did not. Instead, he sent a new commander-in-chief, Mikhail Kutuzov, 70 years old, one eye, 200 kilograms. He slept during meetings. He ate for 3. The Russians adored him. Kutuzov surveyed the situation, the army, and the map, then went to sleep and awoke with a decision: to give a major battle near the village of Borodino. Not because it was the best military plan, but because the Russian army and society demanded a real battle, not eternal retreat. Pride was more important than tactics. September 7th, 1812. Borodino Field. It was the bloodiest single-day battle of all the Napoleonic Wars. 135,000 French against 120,000 Russians. 70,000 killed and wounded in one day. Approximately 1,000 men every 7 minutes from dawn to dusk. The French attacked the redoubts, the Russians held them, then abandoned them, then counterattacked. By evening, the field was covered with bodies several layers deep. Napoleon technically won Borodino. The Russians retreated and abandoned the battlefield. But he lost 30,000 men and failed to destroy the Russian army. Kutuzov withdrew his troops in good order. The army was preserved. The war continued. Napoleon waited for capitulation. It did not come. September 14th, 1812. Moscow. The French army entered the city and found it empty. Moscow, the ancient capital, the sacred city. 3/4 of its population had left. Shops were closed, streets were empty. No delegations, no keys to the city, no negotiators. Only silence and abandoned homes. Napoleon rode into the Kremlin on a white horse and waited for someone to come surrender. No one came. That same night, Moscow began to burn. The Russian governor, Rostopchin, a man of extremely decisive character and zero respect for others' property, had organized arsons throughout the city before leaving. Wooden Moscow ignited like a match. For 3 days, the French fought fires that reignited. 2/3 of the city burned down. Food depots burned. Warm houses for winter burned. Napoleon watched the fire from a Kremlin window and, for the first time in his life, didn't know what to do. He wrote a letter to Alexander offering peace. Alexander did not reply. He wrote another letter. Alexander did not reply again. Napoleon sat in half-burned Moscow for 5 weeks, waiting for a reply that never came. The army plundered what was left of the shops. Discipline plummeted. Horses ate their last hay. Kutuzov camped at Tarutino, south of Moscow, resting, receiving reinforcements, feeding his soldiers, and categorically refusing to fight. Napoleon finally realized that there would be no peace, and that staying in Moscow for winter meant losing his entire army without a single battle. On October 19th, 1812, the French army left Moscow. What the Russians simply call the retreat began. Napoleon tried to head south, through Kaluga, through untouched areas where food and fodder could be found. Kutuzov blocked the way at Maloyaroslavets. 2 days of fighting, the town changed hands 8 times, eventually burning completely. The French could not break through. They had to return along the same ravaged road they had come, through devastated villages, burned cities, and empty fields where no grain, no hay, and no shelter remained. And then winter came, November 1812. In Russia is not what Europeans call cold. It's minus 25 degrees Celsius as a normal temperature, minus 35 degrees Celsius as an ordinary night. French soldiers were in summer uniforms. Some wrapped their feet in straw. Some killed horses to cut open their bellies and climb inside to warm themselves, an old step trick that no Parisian had ever taught them. Horses fell by the thousands. Their hooves couldn't grip the ice. There was no fodder, and the cold finished what hunger hadn't. Artillery had to be abandoned. There was nothing to pull it. Supply wagons with looted goods were left directly on the road. Soldiers dropped their rifles because their hands were too frozen to hold them. Cossacks harassed the flanks, cutting down stragglers. Regular rearguard battles at Vyazma and Krasny saw Ney and his corps cover the retreat with such tenacity that Napoleon would later call him the bravest of the brave. This wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis of a man who had nothing left to lose. End of November. The Berezina River. This word has become synonymous with catastrophe in the French language even to this day. If a Frenchman says, "Qu'est la Berezina?" he means that everything has gone from bad to worse. The army reached the Berezina River in Belarus. They needed to cross, but the bridges were destroyed. The river wasn't entirely frozen. It was an icy slush, neither solid ice nor open water. From the east, Kutuzov pressed. From the north and south, other Russian corps, Chichagov and Wittgenstein, closed in. The French were trapped. Napoleon, and this is one of the few moments where he truly was a genius, organized the construction of 2 wooden bridges across the icy river overnight. Pontooniers worked waist-deep in freezing water. Many died directly in the river from hypothermia. The bridges were built. The crossing lasted 3 days. When the Russians finally broke through to the bank and began an artillery bombardment, the bridges had to be burned while thousands of French soldiers still remained on the other side. Many jumped into the river. Many were crushed by the crowd. Several thousand were taken prisoner. How many drowned? No one counted. The army crossed the Berezina, what was left of it. December 1812. Of the 670,000 men who entered Russia, about 100,000 reached the border. And that word, reached, requires a caveat. Most of them were not soldiers, but shadows of soldiers. Without weapons, without boots, without frostbitten fingers from the journey, without the slightest desire to fight again. Napoleon abandoned the army even earlier. In early December, he handed command to Marshal Murat and sped off to Paris by sleigh. Officially, it was to raise a new army. Realistically, it was because rumors of his demise were already circulating in Paris, and political unrest was beginning that could cost him his throne. Russia cost him more than any lost battle. 570,000 men were lost. Of those, less than a third in battle. The rest were claimed by hunger, disease, cold, Cossacks, and the birch forests of central Russia. All of Europe saw that Napoleon could not just be defeated, he could be destroyed. You just needed a large enough country, a cold enough winter, and a stubborn enough opponent who would refuse to surrender when logic dictated it was time. Alexander thus would enter Paris in 1814. Napoleon would abdicate and go to the island of Elba. Then he would return for 100 days. Then Waterloo. Then the island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where there was nothing but wind, rocks, and British jailers. He would die there in 1821, small, corpulent, dictating memoirs in which the Russian campaign was described as a series of coincidences and others' mistakes. The winter, of course, had nothing to do with it.